In 1838, the governor of Missouri signed a document ordering that an entire group of people be exterminated or driven from the state. Not a foreign enemy, not an invading army. American citizens who had legally settled in Missouri, purchased land, built homes, established communities, and were living peacefully in the northwest part of the state when the governor of Missouri put his signature on an order that used the word exterminated to describe what should happen to them. The document is called Missouri Executive Order 44. It was issued on October 27, 1838 by Governor Lilburn W. Boggs. It stated, in the governor's exact words, that the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Exterminated by official order in Missouri in 1838. 3 days after the governor signed that order, 240 armed men descended on a small settlement called Hawn's Mill in Caldwell County and killed 17 people, 14 men and 3 boys. The youngest was 10 years old. No one was ever prosecuted. The extermination order remained on the official books of the state of Missouri for 138 years. Subscribe right now, hit the button and the bell. To understand what happened at Hawn's Mill, you need to understand what Missouri looked like in 1838 for the people living there. The members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, had been settling in Missouri since the early 1830s, driven by religious conviction that Missouri was to be a gathering place for their community. They were not welcomed anywhere they went in the state. The counties where they settled were largely populated by people who had come from the South, who found the Mormons culturally alien, politically threatening, because Mormons voted together as a community, giving them outsized influence in close elections, and religiously suspect. They accumulated property quickly. They built close-knit communities that looked to outside observers like a state within a state. In 1833, vigilantes forced the Latter-day Saints out of Jackson County entirely. The Missouri legislature created Caldwell County in 1836 as a designated settlement area for the Mormons, essentially a geographic compromise that acknowledged the conflict by trying to contain it. It did not work. As more Mormons arrived from Ohio and the community expanded beyond Caldwell County into neighboring counties, tensions escalated into a series of raids, counter-raids, and armed confrontations across the northern Missouri counties throughout 1838. On July 4th, 1838, a Latter-day Saint leader named Sidney Rigdon delivered a public oration in which he warned that the Saints would no longer tolerate persecution without response. His language was fiery, and it was widely reported across the state. Missourians who were already hostile to the Mormon presence read it as a threat. Rumors of a Mormon paramilitary group called the Danites spread through surrounding counties, painting the Mormons as organized aggressors rather than a persecuted religious minority. The political situation deteriorated through the summer and fall after a skirmish at Crooked River on October 24, 1838, in which one Missourian was killed. Governor Boggs, who had personally supported the displacement of Mormons from Jackson County years earlier, concluded that the Latter-day Saints were in open insurrection against the state. On October 27th, he issued Executive Order 44 to General John Clark directing state militia to treat the Mormons as enemies and exterminate or drive them from Missouri. The language was not accidental and not metaphorical. The governor of an American state used the word exterminate to describe the authorized outcome for a group of American citizens living within his borders. 3 days later, 240 men from 5 Missouri counties rode to Hawn's Mill on Shoal Creek in Caldwell County. There were roughly 75 Mormon families living along Shoal Creek by October 1838. The mill was operated by Jacob Hawn, not a Mormon himself, but friendly to his Latter-day Saint neighbors and workers. About 30 of those families lived in the immediate vicinity of Hawn's Mill and the James Houston blacksmith shop nearby. The day before the attack, a group of about 10 additional Mormon families from Kirtland, Ohio, arrived and camped near the blacksmith shop. They had been traveling and didn't know what was coming. In the afternoon of October 30th, 1838, the 240 men arrived. Women and most children scattered into the surrounding woods. The Mormon men and boys ran toward the blacksmith shop, believing it would provide shelter and a defensible position. It did not. The shop was built of rough-hewn logs with gaps between them, gaps wide enough to push a rifle barrel through. The attackers surrounded the shop and fired through the gaps for half an hour. Militiamen entered to finish what remained. They found 10-year-old Sardius Smith hiding under the blacksmith's bellows. A militiaman named William Reynolds put his musket against the boy's skull and fired. Reynolds later explained his reasoning in terms that were recorded by witnesses. Nits will make lice, and if he had lived, he would have become a Mormon. 78-year-old Thomas McBride surrendered his musket to a militiaman named Jacob Rogers. Rogers shot McBride. Then he took a corn knife and hacked McBride's body apart. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this story matters. 17 people were dead when the militia finished. 14 men and 3 boys. 14 more were wounded. Women were assaulted. Houses were looted. Horses, wagons, livestock, and clothing were stolen from the surviving families who were left destitute in the Missouri cold. The bodies were buried in a dry well, not a cemetery, not graves. A dry well, a mass burial for 17 people whose families were given no time and no dignity for anything else, because the militia that had just killed their husbands and fathers was still camped at the mill for the next 3 weeks, harassing and plundering whatever remained. The people who carried out the attack were not anonymous. 55 men were identified by name in the historical record. They included Major Daniel Ashby of the Missouri State Legislature, Thomas R. Bryan, the clerk of Livingston County. The militia was led by Colonel Thomas Jennings, with Sheriff William Jennings among the captains. These were not outlaws operating outside the law. These were public officials and prominent citizens of their counties, acting in a capacity they believed was either directly authorized by the governor's extermination order or at minimum consistent with the sentiment it expressed. Not one of them was ever prosecuted, not one charged, not one faced any legal consequence of any kind. The Mormon families filed nearly 1,000 petitions and affidavits with state and federal government, documenting in detail exactly what had happened, who was killed, who was wounded, who was assaulted, who had their property taken. Missouri state government received the petitions and took no action. The United States Congress received them and took no action. The men who shot Sardius Smith and hacked Thomas McBride apart with a corn knife went home. Some of them returned to their county offices and continued their public service. The surviving Mormon families had no recourse and no time to pursue one. The militia camped at the mill for 3 weeks after the massacre, continuing to harass whoever remained. The families were forced to leave Missouri entirely over the winter of 1838 to 1839, crossing the Mississippi River into Illinois with whatever they could carry. Joseph Smith, who had been captured and imprisoned during the conflict, eventually escaped while being transferred between Missouri jails with the help of a sympathetic guard. He led the surviving community to Illinois, where they founded the city of Nauvoo on the banks of the Mississippi. Missouri's Executive Order 44, the extermination order, was never withdrawn after the Mormons left. It was not repealed. It was not rescinded. It stayed on the official books of the state of Missouri for 138 years after Governor Boggs signed it. The state that ordered a religious group exterminated simply moved on and left the order in place as if the problem had been handled and no further action was required. It was rescinded on June 25, 1976, when Governor Christopher Bond signed a formal proclamation acknowledging what had occurred and declaring that Missouri has no place for tyranny or persecution. By that point, everyone who had lived through it had been dead for generations. The families who had been displaced from their Missouri land, the children who had survived the blacksmith shop, the women who had been assaulted and left destitute in the November cold. They were not alive to see the state of Missouri acknowledge what it had done. The site of Hawn's Mill in Caldwell County is now a quiet piece of private land on Shoal Creek, in a part of Missouri that most people drive through without stopping. The mill is gone. The blacksmith shop is gone. There is a commemorative marker and a millstone monument in the nearby town of Breckenridge. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints acquired the property in 2012 and maintains it as a historic site. The dry well where 17 people were buried is somewhere on that property. Its exact location is not known. The marker placed in 1941 was moved by the landowner who placed it, unaware that he had shifted it away from the actual burial point. The precise location of the mass grave of the victims of the only state-ordered extermination of civilians in American history has been lost. 17 people buried in a dry well in Missouri in 1838, and the state does not know exactly where they are. Most Missouri residents have never heard of Hawn's Mill. It does not appear in Missouri school history curriculum in any substantial form. The events of 1838, the extermination order, the massacre of civilians, including children, the forced displacement of thousands of Missouri residents across 5 months, occupy a small footnote in the state's standard historical narrative. The Civil War content that follows it receives more attention in most Missouri classrooms than the event that produced the only state extermination order in American history. The state that issued the order moved on as if the problem had resolved itself when the Mormons left. It took 138 years for Missouri to officially acknowledge that the order had ever existed, let alone that it should not have. Governor Kit Bond's 1976 rescission proclamation stated that Missouri has no place for tyranny or persecution. By the time he signed it, the youngest survivor of Hawn's Mill, who might have lived to read that sentence, had been dead for decades. The governor of Missouri signed an order in 1838 calling for the extermination of American citizens within his state. 3 days later, 17 people were killed, including a 10-year-old boy, by a militia that included a sitting member of the state legislature. Nobody faced prosecution. The extermination order stayed on the books for 138 years. The mass grave location is unknown, and the state spent the next 150 years not putting any of that in the schools. That is the Missouri story they buried. It is in the state archives. It is in Governor Boggs's handwriting. It has been sitting there for 186 years. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell. Drop a comment. Did you know about Executive Order 44? About Sardius Smith? About the mass grave nobody can find? Because Missouri buried this story the same way they buried the victims, in a hole, without a proper marker, hoping nobody would come looking. Thank you for watching. The truth doesn't shout. It waits for you to look closer.